Alabama loses 31-17 to Florida State on the road. So it was on the road in Tallahassee. The weather was not a huge factor in this game. Yes, it did start raining at one point. It was not a factor in this game. But, Alabama just loses the game. And first off, I was wrong, right? I was right and wrong. My prediction was absolutely wrong. What I thought the keys to the game were absolutely right. However, my thought and my reasoning behind saying why my prediction was what it was just inaccurate, right? I thought that the key to the game were both the offense and defensive lines on both sides, right? They always say the games are won in the trenches, and I felt like this game was going to be very clearly that. I thought that Alabama had the better offensive line, and I thought that our front seven, even if the defensive line, was missing Tim Keenan, and had some other, things, I really thought that our linebacking core, we talked at length this offseason about how we had a veteran linebacking core, right? Deontay Lawson coming off the injury, but you bring in a guy in the Kai Hill Green from Colorado, and Justin Jefferson comes back. You have all these guys, and you really thought that your front seven was going to be pretty good. So I thought that Alabama was going to have the better front seven compared to their defensive line, or their offensive line, and then our offensive line was going to be able to be really, really good in this game. And I could not have been further from the truth. Florida State showed to have the better offensive line in this game. Alabama's offensive line. Now, part of this was Ty Simpson just held on to the ball too long. I know Pro Football Focus, Nick Kelly tweeted out that Pro Football Focus had Ty Simpson as the longest time from snap to throw of any of the SEC quarterbacks that faced a Power 4 opponent at over almost 3.5 seconds. To put it into perspective, Garrett Nussmeier was about 2 seconds against Clemson. So Ty Simpson was just not throwing the ball fast enough, was not getting through his progressions quick enough. So I'm sure part of that had to do with it. However, there were moments that our offensive line was just getting bullied, right? Caden Proctor gave up 6 pressures from a potential first-round pick. You just can't have that be the case. You can't give up that many pressures from that side of the line. It really felt like at times the offensive line was just getting bullied by Florida State. Credit to their defense. I thought their defense with the stunts and what they were doing on the defensive line, I thought was a very, very big deal and was causing us a lot of problems. But I thought that outside of that first drive that Alabama had, and Alabama did have a really, really good first drive. I thought the script for the first drive was phenomenal. I thought that, when Ryan Grubb was choosing to run versus pass, I thought was really, really good, right? You had like 3rd and 6. Alabama runs the ball. I did not at all expect that. I thought that was a for sure passing down. They get the first down on that run. And I thought that in general, the way that he was mixing everything in at the beginning of the game was really good. Then later on in the game, it really felt like they just went away from the run, right? Alabama only has 87 rushing yards this game, the lowest in an Alabama game in quite some time, especially for an opening game. And when you look at that, it really feels like, so that first drive, Alabama goes 75 yards, and they had one pass completion to Jeremy Renard for 12 yards. They had another pass completion to Ryan Williams for 11 yards, and then the Cuevas for 2 yards, right? So about 25 of those 75 yards were on the passing game. So 50 yards were in that first drive running the football, and you only had 87 for the game. So the question then becomes, why did you go away from the run? Kalen DeBoer was asked about this in the postgame. He accredited it to more of it was really, really tough running, and they weren't getting the explosives that they thought they needed. My concern with that is what we've seen for many years out of Alabama is kind of an impose your will. You run the ball for 3 and 4 yards in the first half because that wears down the defense, and it means when you run that ball for 3 and 4 yards in the second half, you can break a tackle, and that 4-yard run becomes a 20-yard run. Or that 4-yard run, you break 2 tackles, that becomes a touchdown, right? You get that explosive because you've worn down the opposing team. And it really felt like Florida State did that to Alabama, but Alabama did not even try to do that to Florida State. It really felt like we went away from the run early. And it really never got back, right? The running game I thought looked completely fine. Obviously, you're without Jam Miller, but I thought that the combination of Kevin Riley and Richard Young and Daniel Hill was good, right? I didn't think there was any problem with what you were getting. Ty Simpson was even getting a couple of runs in there. I thought that overall, in that first drive, Alabama had a very good game plan, and they just went away from it. And that's a concern for me, right? For me, this also was a lot about the thing that I thought, the preconceived notions that I thought about Alabama, the places where I thought Alabama was going to be very secure, they didn't seem to be, right? You thought that your wide receiving core was going to be phenomenal. I thought that German Bernard was as good as advertised. He had 146 yards on 8 catches. He was really, really good. Pretty much everyone else in that receiving core left some to be desired, Ryan Williams included, right? He had an incredible season last season, obviously highlighted by that Georgia game and what all he did to kind of burst onto the national scene. He was targeted 10 times, had 5 receptions and 3 drops. Now, granted, he is going to be potentially out for another game with a concussion, suffered at the end of that game, so we'll see how he recovers. But he just did not play well up until the point that he got that concussion. It felt like he was being timid with the ball. It felt like he was worried about getting hit over the middle. It felt like he was trying to run before he had the ball in his hands. Like I said, 3 drops. He had the lowest Pro Football Focus grade of any of the receivers on our team, and that's just not something you can have out of your superstar. I thought Ryan Williams, for all of the flash that he is, he was a sure-handed guy last season, and he had 3 drops in this game. And did they end up to be the difference in the game? No, but of course, if Ty Simpson, is getting the ball into your hands, you just got to complete that pass, right? You've just got to catch that ball. So that's something where, coming into this game, you thought that the offensive line was going to be really good. You thought that that's a spot, even without Jaden Roberts, you're missing one of your linemen. You still thought that, your offensive line was still going to be very good and your wide receiving core was going to be solid. And, were there highlights of the offensive line? Sure. Were there highlights of the receiving core? Sure. But neither one of them were as good as they should have been and what you thought they would be coming into this season. But then we jump to the defense. And that's where really the questions in this game come up, right? And I'm going to start this by really talking about this Florida State game. But then in the second half of this podcast, I really want to talk about what has to change if Alabama wants to be able to achieve anything this season, right? So when we go to the defensive side of the ball, to me, that is where this massively changes. And what I mean by that, this changes from, coming into this season, we talked about how Kane Womack obviously had changed around the system when Nick Saban left. And last season was very much a growing pains, getting a new defense. There were going to be certain things that could be called and certain things that couldn't be called. And so there were going to be some growing pains as a part of the defense. And you saw some of those. And I thought that by the end of the season, we kind of talk about the Vanderbilt being the turning point last season for the most part. But that after the Vanderbilt game, there wasn't a single game that it felt like the defense lost us. It really just felt like the offense was not going up to par, right? Obviously that Michigan game, you missed a ton of tackles. It was rainy. It was a mess. I can kind of write that one off. But in just about every other game, it really felt like the offense is what let you down. However, now we come to this game, and I'm looking here at the stats here, and you're, in my mind, the big glaring hole for this team and the place where I thought they were going to be very good this season, and I will admit I was wrong, as were many of the national analysts and local pundits, is the linebacking core. We knew that Deontay Lawson was going to be coming back from injury, so we knew that was a possible issue. However, Justin Jefferson gets the additional year of eligibility from the JUCO ranks. You bring in Nakai Hill-Green from Colorado. Last season we talked at length about how Jahad Campbell obviously going off to the Eagles. You thought that having Nakai Hill-Green coming in, they play a very similar position. Their stats were very similar, a ton of tackles, a ton of sacks, really thought that it was going to be a plug-and-play type situation. And simply put, Nakai Hill-Green was unplayable yesterday. Officially, he finished with 3 total tackles. All 3 of those were assists. He didn't have a single solo tackle. Um, Justin Jefferson had 4 solo tackles with 2 assists. He also missed 3 tackles. Deontay Lawson had 4 solo tackles with 2 assists. He missed 4 tackles. Your linebacking core was an utter disaster yesterday. Now, a lot is going to be said about the defensive line. And I think the defensive line needs serious improvement. I think that starts at the coaching staff. I think that Freddie Roach either is going to have to prove that he can do it this season or has to go, right? I know he's a phenomenal recruiter. I saw somebody in one of my group chats mention that maybe you move Freddie Roach to the Courtney Morgan group and have him be mostly a recruiter and you hire somebody else to be a defensive line, coach that helps with the development. I'm okay with that, right? Freddie Roach is a very, very good recruiter. That is why he's on staff. But what he has done from a development standpoint, the defensive line is just not where it needs to be. I understand that you're deeper in the rotation with having Tim Keenan out and some others, but the defensive line just was not where it needed to be yesterday, and that defensive line was a major issue. However, I think that as much as the defensive line was a problem, the fact that the linebackers were not filling gaps and were just utterly out of position at many, many, many moments in this game. The eye discipline was awful. This was a situation where misdirection and Gus Malzahn just had our number the whole game, right? This was a situation where it really felt like over and over and over again that they just were not ready, right? It just felt like the defensive, that linebacking core was not prepared for this game. I don't know what they prepared for. I know it's very difficult when you're facing a new quarterback, new coordinator that did not even play on this team last season. Neither one of them. So this is a situation where what do you exactly game plan for? I know there was a comment that Kalen DeBoer made about the snap count potentially being weird and that snap count potentially causing some issues as it relates to the team playing on their heels. I'm sure that may have had something to do with it, but it really felt like for huge pieces of this game, the defense was just trying to react to what was happening to them, and they were reacting 3 steps slow, right? Every moment it felt like they were just playing slow. There are plenty of videos floating around of, it's not just the linebacking core. There's videos floating around of a guy like Bray Hubbard where it doesn't even look like he's kind of running. He's just barely jogging. You have guys, Justin Jefferson just got run over, right? There's all of these videos that are now floating around where it just felt like the defense was playing soft, was playing on their heels, was not ready for this football game. And I think the thing that concerns me the most about that is, we talked at length about how Tommy Castellanos makes this comment about Nick Saban's not going to be there to save him. And you kind of expected to hear something back from the defense. And at SEC Media Days, Tim Keenan and Deontay Lawson are like, oh, the disrespect will be addressed. And then they just proved him right. They went out there and proved him right. They went out and basically said, yeah, our defense is not nearly what it was under Nick Saban. We're not giving the intensity. We're not being punished for making bad plays. Nothing is happening the way that it has been happening for many years. This is a situation where the discipline is just not there. Whether it be the penalties, right? There were some dumb penalties in this game. You're about to get off the field and all of a sudden you have Tim Smith. There could be an argument to was he going to be able to stop or not, but it was clearly a late hit. Tim Smith just falls down on somebody, gets an extra 15 yards, automatic first down. It was going to be 3rd and 12. You were potentially going to get out of the drive. But nope, automatic first down. Florida State scores on that possession that would have been potentially getting the ball back. Kane Womack, again, his 3rd down calls are just not good. A 3rd and Kane is becoming a thing, right? 3rd and long is not, they're just not getting off the field. In one moment, they call a timeout in 3rd and long, put one of the worst play calls that I have ever seen out there. I throw Dijon Lee out there on Squirrel White, and he just gets dusted. Right? I understand that you're really, really happy about what you've got in guys like Dijon Lee and Xavier Mincy and some of these other new guys that you have coming in this season. However, the first drive of this game, when you're really trying to get everything settled, is not when you need to throw him out there, right? Putting Dijon Lee on Squirrel White was a mismatch. Squirrel White just absolutely dusted him. Gives up a big play that ends up leading to a touchdown. Again, this just felt like they were trying to get too many guys playing time. And I'm not sure what that's because of, right? Is that because of you promised too much from an NIL perspective and you're like, hey, as a part of this, we're going to play you a certain amount? I don't know what it is, right? Like, I'm not going to point to a specific thing and say this is what the problem is. However, I will say that you just cannot be rotating that amount of guys that early in the game when this team isn't even settled yet, right? Like, you're not even letting people really get settled into the flow of the game. You're putting out these freshmen, and again, we're all really excited about what these guys can do, but when they're putting them in, that's just not the time to do it. I was really, really upset with this defense. You have 8 returning starters to this defense. You know, if you say 7 because you're missing Tim Keenan in this game, this did not look like a defense returning 7 starters. This looked like a defense that was starting mostly freshmen and had a brand new defensive coordinator, right? That's what it felt like. This did not feel like a team that had multiple games under its belt last season with these same guys playing. And that's really, really disheartening. This is a situation, and I've tweeted about it a couple of times. This is a situation with the running quarterbacks that you have on the docket. Diego Pavia is going to eat you for breakfast. Jackson Arnold in Jordan Hare Stadium is going to demolish you if you do not clean up this defense very quickly. You have John Mateer. You've got plenty of running, scrambling quarterbacks on this schedule that they are going to feast if you do not figure out some of the issues with this defense. I think a lot of it starts at that linebacking core. I just think that they are so poorly out of position that it really caused major issues, and it was a huge issue in the run game because when you couldn't stop the run, you couldn't stop anything. Florida State was consistently getting 5-6 yards every single run, and if they're getting 5 to 6 yards every run, they're just going to run it down your throat, and that's what they did, right? That is what Florida State did. They have 236 yards on the ground. This is a situation where they just ran up and just were the more physical team. They bullied you. This was not a situation like that we used to see with Nick Saban's teams where you may lose, but like, it just so happens somebody had a kind of a fluky thing, somebody had a big game, whatever. No, Florida State straight up manhandled you in this game, and that's just not okay, right? When you have the roster that Alabama has with the coaching staff and the players that Alabama has, you just can't get manhandled on both sides of the ball, and that's what happened. Right, this was a very, very, very poor game. Are there some positives you can take out of it? Sure. But at the end of the day, this is a very poor game. And if things do not change in an absolute hurry, it's going to be a really long season. So